Okay, so I encourage you to use the information that's available to you on MLS on your dashboard every week and take a look at what's going on in the market. And you can start out with an overview of the market, showing that in the last 7 days for the Southwest Florida MLS, new listings 866, sold 820, pending 897, price decreases 1,064. So you can see that we're still in a pattern where there's more price decreases every week than there are new listings, which basically is a new listing. So if you take a look, you can hone in on any one of these columns and like to look at the price decreases, and you can see that obviously this is sorted in a sequence, but you can sort it by price. And you can take a look at some of these properties are down 13%. We can go to the other end of the market and see what's happening. But there's a lot of decreases in prices, and they're not usually too small. And you can look at the market from overall. You can go ahead into the criteria and you can put in a particular area. And you can customize. And let's look at, we can go into let's take a look at Port of the Islands. Last 7 days. Not as much activity. You can get it too small. 2 new listings, 2 sold, 2 pending, and 1 price decrease. That's pretty quick moving. But you can go into an area, or you can look at a part of the market, or you can look at you can look where your buyers are looking and where your customers are looking and pick up anything that's new that's happening for them. And as I said, when you go back to the main screen, you're going to see a lot of activity in the market. And the comment that we received when we're on the morning meeting with KWRI is that the expectation is that unless the government starts messing with the debt or raises the interest rates again, that the second half of the year could be better. That would probably mean the interest rates would moderate or go down a little bit and make it look a little bit better for buyers. But right now, what you're seeing with all these price decreases is you're seeing a lot of scrambling going on in the market to get priced right. And as I say, some of these are very small price decreases, but a lot of them are significant. So a lot of sellers have been on the market for quite a while. Here's a days on the market counter. We can look at that. But you can see that some of these properties have been out there for quite a while. And if you're working with a seller, every 10 days, I think I recommend you be looking at the at what's going on in the market and how many offers have we had, how many people have looked at us online, how many people have made a showing request. If you're not seeing any response, then chances are you're not priced where the market is. And what we've seen overall in the stats is that the absorption rate in the Naples market generally is about 30%. 1 out of 3 listings is selling every month. So you got to be taking a look at the information that's available to you. And you can, as I say, you can go into the criteria here and you can parse this data for geo areas. You can parse it for communities and try to get yourself really familiar with what's going on in the market. If you're a listing agent, you definitely want to set yourself up a search for your market, for your immediate area there, and have that search come up and tell you what anything that's going on in the market. In other words, anything that's gone under contract, any new listings, any price changes, you want to know what's going on in that market. So if you need any help, obviously doing that, I'll be glad to help you. It's a simple thing to set up a search and have it notify you whenever there's been changes. And then also there's the info sparks. We could spend a whole day on just info sparks, but you can go in and you can add up to 4 areas. You can do it by county, you can do it by market, and you can do it also by price. And you can get like 13 pieces of information. And then when you want to compare markets, you can add an area here. And let's look at entire MLS. So you can start to put different variables in here and take a look at the changes in median closed price, new listings, homes for sale. Maybe one of the next classes next time we'll just spend a whole day on info sparks and what you can get out of it. And you can easily then, print these listings and it'll print a nice report with your name on it. And you can send that out to your customers or put it on your smart plan. So a lot of good uses for this information, and it's available to you every day. So I think, it's clear that we are in a skill-based market and that we need to keep up and keep our customers up with what's really going on in the market, because if you turn on the national news, it's all pretty much doom and gloom. And you want to keep your customers aware of what's going on in our market. And we, as we looked at the stats last week, let me see what I can do here. It's out of here. Give me 2 seconds here. Let's look at Collier. There we go. So we looked at these a little bit last week, and we looked at Collier. We've looked at various areas of town, but take a look at what we see happening here. Overall, and Lee County is pretty much the same, but let's take a look at what's happening here. Median prices slowed down quite a bit, flattened out in many cases. And again, remember, this is the middle sale, so it's going to fluctuate a little bit, but now the amount of growth in fluctuation is a lot less than. So we're seeing more stability in pricing. We saw that there were more price decreases last week than there were new listings. So you're seeing that. You're seeing less new listings than last year, and you're seeing days on market going up quite a bit. Pending sales down a little bit, and overall sales year over year down. Now, what I expect to see starting in maybe the second half of the year is these numbers will start to become closer and closer. And in fact, if you take out the amazing years of 21 and the first half of 22, and you look at what happened in 2019, before pandemic, these are the numbers that we're seeing are somewhat consistent. So are we returning to a more normal market pattern? Yes, we are. So I think when we're trying to do year over year comparisons, things are looking like they're not quite as good as they were when we go back to 2019 and look at it. So the general consensus that I'm hearing from many of the brokers and the experts is that the second half of 23 assuming we solve the debt problem and assuming that the Fed doesn't start tinkering with rates anymore, is that we'll see some improvement in the market. We'll see the mortgage rates stabilize and go down a little bit. And we'll see the fact that we have a lot more opportunities in the market for buyers. And take a look at another thing that's happening here. Look at the list to sell price. If I show you that from this time last year, it was 100, 101, 102. So really, the market does have some flexibility in it. This is a 4 or 5% gap between what the ask and what the buy is. And what can that be? That could be a seller giving you a credit to buy down your rate or for your closing costs to the buyer. It could be the seller saying, okay, there's a lot of other listings in my market. I'll take a small drop in prices. But what it doesn't say, because this number's been fairly consistent for the last several months, is that prices are crashing, or that we've hit a bubble, or that things are all of a sudden where everything's going to change. We don't see a lot of that. We see things moderating, but we're again comparing to a year and a half of unrealistic. I won't say unrealistic, but really unreal sales that were generated by people coming in from the pandemic and by buyers getting into a frenzy to buy. I think we're starting to go back to a more normal market. Surely, I think this will be our second summer where we've got some seasonality. Last summer was the first summer people could travel, especially to Canada, especially parts up north. Last summer was the first time people could go home for a couple of years. So we saw a kind of uber seasonality effect. And I don't know what we'll see again this year, but surely there'll be some slowdown in the market and the tourist activity. We do see sometimes people come back in the summer to write a contract, whereas they might have just been looking. So you're in touch with your buyers, you're sending them market information, and you're saying, hey, there's a lot of new opportunities on the market. Why don't you come down and take a look at the market? Things are stabilizing price-wise. Things are on the market a little bit longer, which are giving us a chance to negotiate. So I think there's some good things happening in the market, but comparing year over year, it still looks like things are slowed down quite a bit. So some of these numbers will start to stabilize and I think in the last half of 23. And again, barring any external issues that we can't control, overall, the conditions are expected to be a little better in the second half of this year and definitely in 2024. So any questions or comments? The absorption for Collier County, we can look at Lee, but the absorption is a little lower for single family homes. And for a long time, single family homes dominated the landscape when we started into the pandemic. So single family home inventory is higher than condos and higher than the overall market. So you're seeing that maybe 1 in 4 single family homes is selling in a 30-day period. And whereas condos, are up close to 40%. So there's quite a bit of difference in the absorption rate for condos in Collier County than there is in single family homes. So hopefully this is information that we put it out into I think we blast this information to every agent on our mailing list, every agent we have your email address. So hopefully you can share this information with your customers and give them a more realistic picture of what's going on than maybe the nightly news. Captain, what are you seeing in the market? Are you seeing things get a little bit better?
I'm Jeff, what you're echoing is basically what we are seeing, and that's what we're trying to broadcast to our buyers right now, and also keep our sellers, confident that we can get their home sold. I think Memorial Day weekend is always kind of a weekend where you do have travel going on, but it seems like after we get through this, June and July have always, go back to 1920, have been good months for us, me personally. So I'm staying optimistic right now, controlling what we can control.
Yeah, if the external factors don't disrupt us, I think you're right on. Brian, you're usually on Denny's call on Friday. He's, if you haven't been on Denny Grimes' script and role play call on Friday afternoon, you're missing a treat. Denny may be the best script and role play guy in the history of real estate. But I see you smiling, Brian. But you know, I mean, one of the things that I was on last Friday, and John, I think, was doing most of the talking, but one of the things that they working with your buyers and your sellers is motivation. I think people have a tendency to say, oh, you know, I'm interested in selling. I got a 3.5% mortgage and I can't afford to move. Or a buyer saying, well, you know, I can't pay 6.5. I'm going to wait for the market to crash and the rates to go back down to 2, and that's where I'm at. And you know, that's an easy thing to say to somebody when you're talking to them, but what's their motivation? Do they want to, do they need to move, or do they want to move closer to family, or do they want to downsize? If there's motivation for people to buy or sell real estate, then we need to use that motivation and we need to translate that into what the pure financial differences are. You know, people look at a house that's $700,000, but they don't look at $700,000. They look at, what's my cost of ownership? What's my monthly payment? What's the insurance cost? What is the cost for me to own that home on a monthly basis? And that's how we budget. That's how we look at things as consumers. So when you're talking to a buyer or seller and they're giving you the well, you know, I don't want to get rid of my 3.5% mortgage, you know, and get a 6.5% mortgage, that would be killing me. But let's say in the case of somebody that wants to downsize, so what's happening in the market? Do you think you'll pay less than you did last year? Well, yeah. Well, maybe then your house, the market that you sell in is the market you buy in. So you may sell for a little bit less than your neighbor did last year, but you're going to buy a new residence for less than it was a year ago. So it's all relative. And then when you break it down into maybe I'm going from, you know, a larger home to a smaller home, and it breaks down the monthly payment, it's not that much. And you break it down into, for your motivation, here's what the costs are. And Brian, you jump in here. I mean, he does a masterful job of talking to people and presenting the reality of what things are going to cost for them. And I think that the script and role plays that they do really helpful, don't you think, Brian?
They're fantastic, I would say. I would encourage everybody, if you can jump. And I don't get to make all of them either, but I make the ones I can. For that reason, they hit some. It's not like they're trying to change someone's mind. They're helping them see everything and help them make the best decision for themselves. And a lot of times, like you said, Jeff, they don't see all those little moving parts about, okay, yeah, your interest rate's higher, but you may well be buying down. You're paying less than you would have last year. And it's super helpful for me. So I agree with you. I think they're great.
Yeah, I think that if you spend enough time listening to Denny, he just does everything with questions. He doesn't make any statements. He doesn't try to sell anybody anything. He says, well, now if you were to buy this house for 500,000 and sell your house for 700,000, and what would that look like to you? You know, and so it's constantly taking the motivation, let's say, to downsize or move closer to family or whatever, and translating into, what would that look like for you? What exactly does that mean to you? And I think he had one lady on there that was $1,100 a year, And he said, well, do you drink Starbucks coffee? And she said, of course I do. And he said, well, what happens if you drank one less cup of Starbucks every day? You'd be ahead. When you break down the motivation and talk to people about what their objectives are, it's certainly not as onerous as we see with the rates and with the news that we're seeing, of all the catastrophic events going on and everything. So, and I think overall our area, we can look at Lee County real quick, but our area has been pretty resilient from the storms. There we go. Share screen. So look at Lee County, which kind of took the brunt of, Ian. We certainly experienced quite a bit of Collier. Mainly the main storm surge and a lot of the damage was done to the coastal areas of Lee. And, you can take a look at the numbers in Lee. Now, obviously, they're balanced by the inland homes and areas that weren't damaged at all. But, take a look, even less inventory than Collier, but much greater absorption across the board. So that market is showing more movement and more activity, even though the sales are year over year down. The market is still pretty resilient in Lee County. Prices pretty stable. Absorption, as I said, across the board, quite a bit higher, especially for single family homes, and inventory's lower. So, regardless of how you want to slice this up for a customer, if we go back to the sales that we had in 2019, which tend to parallel some of the numbers we're seeing in volume, we had at least twice as much inventory. So we're still in a seller's market in 3.5 months of inventory. 6 months is a balanced market, and many would argue in our market, because we're more resort oriented, that maybe more than 6 months is balanced. But let's take 6 months. You're still not anywhere close in either Lee or Collier to a balanced inventory. You're getting closer in some markets. I think when we looked at just Marco Island, we saw things coming more closer to a balanced market because there's a lot more inventory relative to the sales. So it's important that you understand what's going on in the market and that you have a good elevator speech. It's like, hey, Jeff, what's going on in the market? Well, you know what? The market has a lot of signs of promise. The list to sell ratios are giving buyers some opportunity to negotiate. The increased inventory has given more choices for buyers. Prices are holding stable. Things staying on the market a little bit longer, give you a chance to do your homework and you're not jump in and put a bid on until you've done your homework. I think I was working with Lisa last week, and just the insurance factor alone can change your attitude and your outlook on your affordability. So make sure you understand that the pace of the market is much more sensible than it was a year ago, when people were just multiple offers, crazy numbers. It's more stable now. You have a little bit more time to educate your buyer and to produce an offer that's more realistic. And again, remember, in all cases, call the listing agent, talk to the listing agent, find out what's going on with that seller. Is there anything that seller wants in an offer? Forget the price. Do you have multiple offers? Where are the offers coming in at? Is there anything your seller would like to have, like a couple of weeks or a month of post-closing occupancy? Things that the seller might like in your offer that can make you shine. And again, if there's flood insurance involved, always ask if the seller has flood insurance and ask to assume their policy, because the buyer can save a substantial amount of money doing that. So just some things to go. We always spend the first few minutes of each class going over the market and looking at the market. And not so bad. Some areas, sellers are more willing to negotiate. They're willing, I see a lot of contracts coming through with sellers giving credits to buyers for their closing costs or to buy the rate down. So, and I see a lot more financed offers coming through than we did a year ago. A year ago, if you weren't cash, you really, your offer was not as strong as all the cash offers that were coming in. But now, yes, we're hearing some multiple offers, but not as many. And we're seeing the pace of the market change, probably in favor of a little bit in favor of the buyer, but still, with only 3.5 months of inventory, still there's not there's more demand than there is supply. All right. Any questions or comments or suggestions before we move over to the contracts? All right, let me change gears here. Got my share. I probably need to go to. Down to neighbor. Okay, so today's topic is how to write a bulletproof contract. And while I'm bringing this thing up, this is from a paper that was written by Holly Harmon, who was one of the finest real estate attorneys in Naples, for a project that we worked on with the Legal Resources Committee. And Holly passed away a couple of months ago, very suddenly, way before her time. So God bless you, Holly, and we're gonna be thinking of you today when we're going through our contract discussions. Great lady and great legal mind. All right, I'm going to bring up the neighbor sales contract as our guide. And let's see what I got here. Share the screen, bring the sales contract up. Share that. Okay. All right. So this is an informal discussion and it's meant for you to chime in and share your thoughts. So I'm gonna go, I'll put this article up either on Facebook or I'll send it to you, but it's a wonderful article. It's the type's a little too small to show on the screen, but anyhow, the first thing Holly says is read the contract. Now that seems like master of the obvious, but I know for those of you that have been writing contracts and active with your co-brokes, how many have really read the contract? How many understand the really important parts of the contract and more importantly, can explain it to your customer? The reason that we have these classes and the reason that I spend so much time teaching is because I've learned in my years in real estate that the contract is your relationship with your customer in a transaction. The more you know it, and the better you can represent it and explain it to your customer, the more of a chance you have of A, getting a closing, and B, having your customer work with you for the rest of their real estate life and continue to call you back and ask you for your input and recommend you to other people. So the better you know this contract, the better off you are. And I always say, when you're first working with a buyer or even a seller, you want to give them a copy of this contract and say, look, I'd like to have a cup of coffee with you and go over this with you, because in the heat of battle, when the offers start rolling in, there's too much emotion. There's too many things going on, too many things to think about. So I think it's really important that you know the contract and that you're able to share it with your customer prior to them making an offer or putting their, or once they've listed with you, prior to them starting to get contracts in. So I think that's the first point here is know this contract, know what's in it, know the key points of it. And, you know, for example, just right off the bat, who's the seller? Maybe, you know, now you know to go to the warranty deed on the property appraiser site and say, who owns this property? That has to be primary importance when you're writing a contract, Because if you don't put the proper sellers in there, you can lose a contract just as easy as you can write one. So, and with the buyer, you're working with a buyer. I think the most important question you can ask a buyer before you write the contract is, how do you want to take title on this property? And if they're saying, well, we're thinking of forming an LLC or we're thinking of forming a trust, okay, that's even though all neighbor contracts are assignable and FAR bar contracts are assignable when properly identified, you still want the buyer to be thinking about, if they're going to do a trust or an LLC, you still want the buyer to be thinking about how they want to take title of the property and who wants to be on that title. So those are the questions that you need to ask, right out of the get-go. Who's the seller? And how does the buyer want to take title? So, reading down through the rest of this contract, obviously the next thing is what conveys. And, if you tune in with me every week, you'll notice that I'm always making an analogy to tennis, even though I'm not a tennis player, but I know that in tennis, love means nothing. So when it's 40 love, that means that the opponent has nothing. And in real estate, the terms turnkey, as shown, as per MLS, furnished, partially furnished, and I think I've thrown in as shown, they mean absolutely zip in real estate. Without a detailed inventory, without something to reference, you could go to that walkthrough and what your buyer was expecting is not there. Now that's the wrong time and the wrong place to have drama. So remember, when you're working with a seller, you need to understand, the seller needs to understand what's going to convey with the sale. And if they have some complicated electronics, all of that and the software, that has to convey with the sale. That's running the house. If they have TVs, are they going to take the TVs? They're going to leave the TVs. Remember, if a buyer wants that nice 75-inch plasma sitting over the fireplace and they don't put it in the contract and they go in the walkthrough with you and all there is a bracket and a wire hanging there, could be a trip to Best Buy for you. So you want to make sure you try to understand the contract and understand the really important parts of the contract and be able to share it with your customer. All right. So what are some of the other key parts of this contract that we need to look at? Obviously, if there are specific parking places or cabana numbers or storage lockers, they need to go in there. That's what those pound signs are for. Remember that on line 36, the proceeds of the mortgage are what are protecting the buyer for their financing contingency. That is the number that if they can't borrow, they're able to exercise the contingency and get their money back. So make sure that's a number that makes sense. If you put in a number that's too low, and then the buyer decides to borrow more money and can't get their money, they're not protected from the financing contingency. So always give the seller enough time to answer your offer. I see at least a half a dozen contracts come in every month where the buyer sends the contract over to the seller and gives them a day to answer. The seller answers in 2 days, and we don't have a contract because that little date and time in there is expired. So my suggestion is obviously always call the listing agent and find out all the information you can find. Try to establish a good rapport with that listing agent. You're going to work together. You're a pro. You know the contract. What can you tell me about how long does the seller need to respond? If it's a trust, or if it's in probate, or if there's some complications, or if the seller's on a cruise or doesn't understand how to use email. Those are all things that factor into putting the right number in there and picking a closing date that works for everybody. So here's some of the things that are important to talk about with the seller for the buyer. Please don't put Friday in on line 50. Especially if there's financing involved or there's wire transfers and they don't happen. And your customer really wants to move in over the weekend. Why not put Wednesday? That gives a chance for the lender to miss Thursday and come in on Friday with the package. And now everybody's happy. We have keys, we move in. And so I would say, make sure you put the closing date in there that makes sense. And try not for Monday. It's usually Mondays when all the problems from Friday and Thursday carry over. So I think a Tuesday or a Wednesday is when you want to close, just from my experience. And while we're on that subject, if the sellers or buyers selling a house and closing and they say, okay, we're going to do that in the same day, just say, sorry, I don't play Russian roulette. That's not a game that I play. And so let's figure out 4 or 5 days in between so we can make sure that if your closing gets delayed, you don't delay this closing and you don't get the domino effect because the seller may need the money to buy something else. So without belaboring the point, if you got 2 closings, give yourself 4 days, 4 or 5 days in between them. Remember that the closing date is the only time of the essence date in this contract. And therefore, if it doesn't happen when it's supposed to happen and there's no extension, that's when default occurs and the buyer, and seller are at risk if they're not able to meet that date.
Jeff, I have a quick question.
Sure.
So back to page 1, when you're putting in the purchase price, the initial deposit, mortgage amount, etc. So you make an offer, then there's negotiation, and then you decide on a final sell price, right? So that could change those numbers. Do you just do an amendment once you have final agreement?
Well, I see mostly people use strike-throughs. They strike through the price as long as it's one counter. If you get 2, then maybe you're better off, doing an addendum or doing a new contract. But I see a lot in this contract where people strike through the price, put in the new price and initial it. And remember that your effective date is the last date that either party signs or initials the contract or an addendum. So you want to make sure that you always put in a date next to an initial. I see a lot of contracts come through where that people just initial the changes. Now that could be 3 or 4 days from the last date of a signature or another initial. So you could lose 3 or 4 days on your effective date.
So the counteroffer is not on, it's not on a counteroffer form. It's just, is it verbal and then you just strike out on the contract?
Bar has a counteroffer form. We've never been successful in getting one approved for NABOR. I have a contract now where it was a NABOR contract and they submitted a FAR counteroffer, and I'm not sure, I hope that's legal, but don't mix the contracts. But we do not have a counteroffer form. Suggestion is if it goes for more than one counter, you send a new contract over because it's a little, they can get really messy if you have multiple changes trying to figure out what the last change was. But most of the time I see the contracts are changed in place. I agree with you that we should have a counteroffer form, but I've proposed it 2 or 3 times in my tenure on legal resources and I never get any traction. So there you go. Lisa?
So I just want to make sure I understand. So if we have the contract and that we strike something out and make the change, we should make sure everybody initials that and puts the date
Correct.
that there's initialing that. Is that what you said?
Correct.
Okay.
Otherwise, let's say you have 2 counters.
Yeah.
maybe in parts of the contract, and all there are is there's no date. And the only thing that's good is the signatures at the bottom of the page that have a date. So I've seen people lose 3 and 4 days on their inspection period because there was no dates on the initial, so everything reverted back to the date on the, the contract was originally signed. So be careful with that. And, Dot loop is really good at putting the initial right in with the date right in with the initial. DocuSign, you gotta drag the date in, which is a little extra work, but make sure you have the date next to every initial that your customer puts on there. All right?
Okay, I have another question. I know we're going back to the beginning of the form, but you know that I have this problem, and I'm still having this problem right now. With getting the actual owner's information, the seller's information, the who's selling you the property. I know that when we looked, we had stuff that was sealed and we couldn't see. How do we go about doing that? If that's sealed, does the listing broker, if there is a listing broker on the other side, it's her responsibility to give that to me? And how would I check to make sure that the information she's given me is correct if I can't see it with the county?
I think you could do it in your call to the listing agent.
Okay,
I think that particular one that I was working with you on, the
yeah,
last deed was sealed.
right,
There was no way we could tell anything about all we went back to was the original deed, which was 20 years ago or something. So I think that's a question that you have to ask the listing agent. Can you please give me, the exact titling of the contract from the seller? In that particular case, it was like a paragraph. So you just have to put as per addendum, or as per, I would say as per addendum, then put an addendum together and say the seller for this contract is, and then put in what they give you.
okay, thank you.
Jeff, can we go back to the acceptance deadline, line 4344? So, but you said time is of the essence, only for closing. But what about the dates you put in for acceptance and counteroffer, etc.?
In the NABOR contract, they are not time of the essence, but they're not nothing. If, let's say you miss a deposit, your buyer calls you and says, I can't get to the bank today. It's going to be Monday before I can get to the bank. Okay, first of all, a communication opportunity to the other side. But second of all, if the deposit is due on Friday and doesn't arrive, and they call you on Monday and say, where's your deposit? You say, well, we're renting it today. There was a problem. That's okay. But if it persists, you can make the date time of the essence by notifying the other side and giving them time to cure. So if you say, okay, it's Monday, the deposit didn't get in today, but if you don't have it in by close of business Thursday, we'll consider you in default. So you can make a date, turn a date into a default date in the contract by notifying the other side and giving them time to cure. Most of the time, communication, the buyer doesn't have a chance to get to the bank, or the bank, they went to the bank and the bank didn't get the wire out in timely. So usually it's a short delay. You usually can work it out. In far bar, you can in default. So I think the framers of this contract are wanting to say, hey, let's have everybody have a little flexibility and try to keep the deal together.
Okay, so that kind of applies to the acceptance deadline of the contract and for the counteroffer deadline and things like that as well.
Correct. So going down her list here, we'll just kind of keep going through this contract and talking about some of the important points. But again, we talked about the selection of the closing date. And if there's financing, make sure the lender has some buy-in here. And also maybe you want to even pad the lender a little bit, because oftentimes all good intentions are great, but they don't get the paperwork out to the closer in time. So give yourself time. Don't try to rush the closing date, because that's where you can play with default. So let's look at the financing contingency here and talk a little bit about that. She has a paragraph in here about the financing contingency and how important it is. So let's talk about what's going on here. If the buyer selects financing contingency, you got to check the box on line 60B. All right, and then you have to select the type of loan. And the line on 64 is protection for your buyer. If you leave it blank, then your buyer basically loses the protection of the financing contingency if the rate is much higher than they want to pay, and you don't have a cap in there. Too bad, so sad. The buyer is not going to be able to get out on a contingency if you put something in there and they have questionable credit. They don't have much of a down payment, and so they get 7.5. And if you didn't put 6.5 or 7 in there, the buyer's not going to be able to get out if they have a higher rate due to their credit or due to their debt to income ratio or something that may affect their loan rate. So even though you're quoted in your pre-approval letter a rate, until there's an actual rate lock by the lender or the buyer in writing, that percentage is there to protect you. So you put 6.5 in there, and all of a sudden, the day after the Fed raises the rate, everything goes to 6 3/4. That's protecting your buyer for the call. All right, so be careful not to leave. I see people leave that blank, and I don't know why. It's just, you're giving up an opportunity to protect your buyer from some kind of a credit irregularity there. Making loan application not later than. Again, I'm a fan of putting stuff in there rather than leaving it blank, even though the default value is 30 years and in fact 5 days after the effective date. And that's easier if you fill it in. Let's talk about line 68. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of the NABOR contract, both by buyers and sellers and agents. Let's talk about what this is. All right. The financing contingency is a statement by the buyer saying, I'm gonna waive my financing contingency, and therefore the deposits that I've made are firm. So in this day and age, even though we don't have a ton of inventory, we've got twice or 3 times the inventory we had a year ago. Many buyers are saying, well, I'm not waiving my financing contingency. This is basically a date, and the date needs to make sense to the seller. I've seen that default to 45 days be after the closing date. For the seller, right? So pick a date in there, and if you're a listing agent, pick a date, agree to a date that's at least a couple of weeks before closing, so that the seller can hire a moving van, start moving their stuff, and give some closure to the seller and their expectations, that you're going to be able to have a positive result from the bank. At that point, you may have loan approval. Obviously, all loan approvals from lenders these days are conditional, but you have loan approval. So I think that it's important that that date be discussed with the lender, it be discussed with the buyer, and that it be meaningful to the seller. And that is a point that I'm seeing in the contracts nowadays, that the buyer's like, well, I don't have any incentive to waive. I don't want to put my deposits at risk. And the remedy, if they don't waive, is that the seller can cancel. Either party can cancel, but the buyer has to have a note from their lender in order to cancel. But the seller can terminate. Now, for a while there, when the market was hot and there wasn't much inventory, the seller could say, too bad, so sad, you didn't waive yesterday. I'm canceling the contract. Here's your money back. I'll see you around. But in this day and age, the sellers are less willing to give up maybe a contract that maybe a little more money they could get today, so they're willing to say, okay, well, the buyer doesn't waive, I don't necessarily want to cancel, but it definitely puts the seller in a less than advantageous position. So one of the things that I thinking about working on is a clause for the seller to say, okay, if, you don't waive by the contingency date, some part of your deposit's going firm. The buyer in this particular case and under these market conditions doesn't have a lot of skin in the game, in that if they don't waive and the seller doesn't cancel, there's no financial penalty to the buyer. Lisa, you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes, so on line 68, the date you said was 2 weeks? Approximately, give it about 2 weeks before the closing date?
On what, on line 50? Oh,
68, 68.
you have a simultaneous close where the seller.
No, no, on 68.
68. Yeah, I
Yes,
think that a couple of weeks before closing.
okay,
Agent, I want my seller to have, even if the buyer at that date says, I'm not waiving, at least it's a decision point for the seller to say, I've never heard from these people. I don't have anything in writing. Have you heard anything no, I haven't heard anything. Maybe the seller is gonna exercise their right at that point, if they got a sellable house. But I think you gotta, if you're the listing agent, you want to give the seller a period of time to determine what they're gonna do. If that date is 2 days before closing, that means the buyer can cancel and get their money back 2 days before closing. And that doesn't give the seller much time to react and commit to a moving van or moving their stuff in storage or whatever they're gonna do. So
Okay.
that date is becoming a more difficult date, given the market conditions, than it has been. The same.
Wouldn't it matter, Jeff, like how long it's going to take for the lender to give full approval? How long does it take here for that?
I think it's dependent on the lender. I guess I don't know, Captain, what are you seeing? I'm seeing most lenders can get the job done in 30 to 45 days, but probably a lender will tell you today that they could close a loan in somewhere around 30 days. The demand isn't as high as it was, but the lender should give you that guidance, right?
So if it's 30 days to get the loan commitment, then you would add another 2 weeks to closing, so about 6 weeks for closing.
Yeah, I think, that's part of your negotiations with the seller. Maybe the seller wants a little bit longer close, and maybe they'll look more favorably on your offer monetarily if you give them a little longer close or you accommodate some of their needs. But what are you seeing out there in loans, Captain? You seeing 30 days?
The people that I work with can normally get it done in 30 to 35 days. If I represent the buyer, then I'm going to talk to whoever loan officer they're using and say, how much time do you comfortably need to do this based on, our customer? And if I represent the seller and I don't know the agent very well or the way they wrote the contract, then sometimes I call and I call the lender or get somebody to call and I just say, hey, are you comfortable? You can really do this in X, Y, Z. But normally 35 days is, normally plenty of time, So if you write the contract for 45 days, you're well within the area, time frame.
So let me ask you what your thoughts are. If we would have some language in there that we could put in to say that if the buyer fails to waive their contingency on the contingency date, that a certain portion of the deposit would go firm. I just think there's not much skin in the game for a buyer these days. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you. I mean, I basically have followed almost all your advice so far. You always led me the right way, and I've only had to. I've never had to execute that. I've only had to remind the other side, and I usually got the answers I was looking for. And also, a buyer's agent really doesn't want to waste their time either. They want this to be smooth and work. So I think if you come at it in a professional manner, you usually get the answers from the buyer's agent and the lender, fairly cooperative, So, but I'm not against that, no.
Okay. All right, so the mortgage contingency date is something that I want to make sure everybody can understand and explain to their buyer, because that's where I see a ton of confusion when people are calling me about what that date means. So I still think that regardless of whether there's a commitment that if the buyer doesn't waive, that some of the deposit goes firm, I still think the buyer has an obligation to keep the seller informed as their progress of the loan, and you know, and there's a thing called good faith in these contracts. So I you know, I think that there needs to be good communication, and I think there needs to be some meaning to that date. That's all.
Yeah, when I look at a contract as a listing agent, if I get one over and they left that blank all the way to the end, that's one of the first things that I point out to the seller and say, we need to correct this. Sorry, Jeff, didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's fine. I appreciate that. That's essentially what's happening in the field. I mean, if you don't put a date in there, I've seen 45 days be 5 days past the closing date. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. If I'm a listing agent, why would I want the seller to accept a contract that they can get out of on the day of closing? You know. Another area of this paragraph that we seem to struggle with a little bit is when this 75 to 77 is one of the other more confusing parts of the contract, and it's meant to protect the buyer when the buyer has a clear to close and the lender just can't get the package. Remember, the closing date is a default date, right? So one of the things that is really important is that if the lender isn't going to be able to perform, but through no fault of the buyer who has the clear to close, they can notify the seller that we're going to take up to 10 days to close. But remember, what's the first 3 words in this paragraph? If buyer waives, 4 words. Buyer waives this contingency. So a lot of people say, well, you know, my lender's still working on my buyer's contract, and we get automatic 10 days. And that would be no. No, for the reason that you don't have a clear to close, and no, for the reason that you can't automatically use this extension unless the buyer's waived and unless they've notified the other side in writing. But I've had agents call and say, I don't know what you're talking about. I get 10 days. No, you don't get 10 days. And it has to be under certain conditions that the buyer can request a delay of up to 10 days. So be careful with that. And that's not a automatic process. And I think people tend to read that and say, oh, no problem. If I can't make it on the closing date, I can extend for 10 days. The answer to that is no. And we bolded this last part: delivery of documentation evidencing a loan commitment does not constitute a waiver of the financing contingencies. So just because you've gotten a note from the buyer's agent that the loan's approved, it is always the case that they're going to be able to close. All right, so let me go through a few other, we got a little time here to go through and look at the important points of a bulletproof contract. Make sure that if you're in a community, especially one that has had any kind of storm damage, that you reach out to the association, whether it be a property manager or an office on the grounds of the property, and find out what's going on. I mean, especially if your seller is a investor or doesn't, you know, come to the property that often, they may not be aware of potential upcoming special assessments. And the way this paragraph works is if the seller fails to notify the buyer of an upcoming pending special assessment, and one comes to pass after the effective date, the buyer is still responsible for that. But if the seller had knowledge, let's say that the meetings have said, well, we've submitted our claim to the insurance company and we're waiting for results from the insurance company, but there may be an assessment, That's information that needs to be given to the buyer in advance of the signing the contract so that the buyer's aware of it. If the buyer's not aware and the seller was aware, there's this line at the bottom of the contract that says that the buyer's responsible up to 1% of the purchase price. The seller has to pay the rest, or the buyer may terminate. Okay. If there's existing leases on the property, make sure you jump out on that, have the buyer look at them if you've got the buyer. If it's a VRBO or home away, the transition is complicated because the seller can't just transfer their VRBO account over to the buyer. So that needs to really have, I think, an attorney or somebody look at that and do some kind of an detail analysis of how ownership in those leases is going to be transferred over. We've taken out the choice to turn this into an as-is contract. You're either going to do an as-is contract separately, or you're going to do this one. Please don't waive inspections. We developed a waiver that we want the buyer to sign if for some reason they decide to waive inspections. And if theoretically, if the buyer says, oh, I don't need to inspect, which is something usually that costs a few $100 to make sure there's no defects in the property, the buyer really has no right to go into the property until the walkthrough inspection. So then my question is, if ice cold in the house and everything's fine when you write the contract, you don't do an inspection and you walk into the walkthrough and it's warm and kind of moist. How can you prove that the seller hasn't maintained the property in the condition it was in? Because you didn't have any baseline, you didn't have an inspection. So please don't let your buyer don't let your buyer say, well, I'm not going to do an inspection, I don't need one. It's really it's a simple process, costs a few $100, and it can really save the buyer from a lot of grief that they could discover after closing. I had a customer that raised particular cane with me and the listing broker about a leak they found in the air conditioning system that resulted in mold and some significant cost. And our question to him was, well, why didn't you inspect and have somebody look at the air conditioner? Oh, they never would have found that leak, he said. Great. He had this much recourse. And we asked the buyer sign a release to Keller Williams and its agents if they just declined inspections. We have the form, I'll be glad to send it to you or put it in your command account, but buyers really are not in a position where they should ever waive inspections. Lisa.
So I have a question for you. I know what I've heard, I haven't seen this myself, but what I've heard is when the market was hot, people were waiving their inspections so that they could get the upper hand on getting a house. So if they choose to do that, my thoughts are, whether they want to do it or not, you should just always get it done. And if the seller isn't going to allow them any credits, you still know before you're making your final, payment on this thing, what you're getting into. How does that work?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And that's why we developed this buyer's notice, was that if the buyers think that they're going to get a better, they're going to get a more favorable treatment because they're not going to inspect. The suggestion is they put into the contract that the buyers will inspect, but will not ask the seller for any repairs or credits, which in effect, at least the buyer has a chance to find out if there's anything major league wrong with the house that they're going to end up with after they close. So I don't see that happening anymore. I don't think there's, if there are multiple offers, it's not the frenzy that they had before where people were like, I need a mortgage, but I'll go in cash with no inspections just to get this house. And that's when a lot of problems began. People had latent, problems that they could have, an inspection would have easily found them. They got them after they moved in, like this guy that was so rabid about, trying to find somebody to pay for his mold problem, and yet he refused all of the things that would have protected him.
So if in fact someone did that and said, okay, the seller doesn't have to pay for any of the damages, anything that they find. At that point, if it's something major that's found, is the buyer able to back out of the contract?
If you do that in an as-is contract, yes. If you do that in a regular contract, you would probably have a hard time. But remember what the theory is of the NABOR contract, that buyer default is deposits made to date. So if I was working with a buyer and the buyer said, I absolutely, I'm going to inspect, but I'm not going to ask for any repairs, then I say, great, let's put $5,000 down and $50,000 down in 20 days or whatever my inspection period is. And then if it was excruciatingly bad, I'm out 5,000.
Right.
Remember,
Okay.
you can put 5,000 and 50,000, and if you default, it's 55,000. There's no benefit from putting down a small deposit and then a larger deposit. So I think that that's one of the things that in the NABOR contract, if the buyer, there's not in some cases, there's not an absolute right for the buyer to walk away. If the buyer had inspected and asked the seller to repair, and the seller said, nope, I'm not repairing it, then the buyer has a window to get out. But if the buyer waived inspections or said, I'm not going to ask you for any repairs or credits, then the buyer would be hard pressed to, be able to walk away with the money.
Okay.
So I think it's really simple to inspect. And in the heat of battle, when there were so few homes available, maybe you could justify not inspecting and taking the risk. I don't see that much in this market. Even though there's only 3.5 months supply, there's generally, you go into communities, there's usually more than one option. So if the seller says, I'm not fixing anything, you can't inspect, then I think maybe that's a red light for me to say, do you really want this property?
Okay. Thank you.
A few more minutes here. Remember that insurance availability and cost is a disclosure in this contract, right? It's not a right of the ability to cancel, all right? So when you talk about insurance, and again, I'm kind of an insurance junkie because I've been following the insurance industry in Florida for the last 10 or 12 years. Do your homework up front. Make sure that your buyer knows as much as possible about if they get a mortgage, they're going to have flood insurance. Maybe the seller doesn't have flood insurance because they paid cash or they've elected not to have it. That's a risk for your buyer who may not be able to get flood insurance at a reasonable price. And again, if they're financing, all this goes back into their cost of ownership. And by ferreting this out early, you're not exposing the buyer to as much risk. Okay. So I think out of all the things in the disclosures, the insurance availability and cost is one of the key items, and the cost of it can be maybe prohibitive for a buyer, but the buyer doesn't want to get in there and find out that what they thought was a $3,000 a year homeowner's policy is now $10,000. Then the buyer is going to be, well, why didn't we know that before we jumped in? This community investigation paragraph is a kind of a buyer beware thing. Obviously, if you're in a condo, you have 3-day right of refusal to look at all the documents and decide that you don't want to proceed. But in an HOA, if the HOA disclosure is provided timely with the contract and it's accurate, the buyer doesn't really have the ability to get out. If in their investigation, they find things about the community that's not something they like. So again, upfront homework is the best, is the very best thing you can do. And now we see days on market out to 50, 55, 60. You got a little time. It's, the market's not turning over anywhere near as fast as it was. If your customer is looking at a property that was damaged by the storm, we recommend that they get an expert in how to calculate this 50% rule, because it's complicated, and what you can do and what you can't do, and things that are count toward the 50% rule and don't. It's very complicated. Inspection period, again, I've seen these bargained down to 5 days, 3 days. That's a tough thing to be able to go ahead and inspect and get the report back and get any kind of estimates on repairs. So I think you want to keep that around 10. Maybe you could live with 7, but if it goes below that, you're going to get your report. You can get an inspection done in that time. But if you need additional analysis of the roof or of something going on in the house, the air conditioner, you don't have time to do it. And you know, you can put yourself in a position where you don't get to do the investigation and you don't get to get a full picture of what's going on in the house. Another thing that's really important to understand is what's defective and what's cosmetic, and what the buyer has the right to ask for and what they don't. And I've got a little chart that I've made that I'd be glad to share with you, but it's down here. I think it's 3. Yeah. This paragraph here kind of sums it up, that, and it's, you know, it says systems and equipment shall be in working condition of operating in the manner designed to operate. If the air conditioner is a little noisy, but it's cooling to 17 degrees or whatever it's supposed to, it's operating in the manner that it was designed. Roof, ceiling, interior, exterior walls, foundations shall be in working condition of structurally sound, watertight, and free from wood rot. Okay, we added wood rot a couple of years ago because many of the doors, especially the garage doors that open out into the yard or the side yard, are made out of wood, or they're steel with wood in the middle, and they rot. So now you can ask the seller to address that. Seawalls, docks are if structurally sound. So again, this is a definition of what the seller needs to take remedial action. And this last 3 lines, cosmetic condition, defined as, you know, normal wear and tear, aesthetic imperfection, corrosion, tears, worn spots, discoloration of floor covering. Hey, this is unless it's a brand new house, there's wear and tear. And that's what this is designed to avoid, is a lot of one-dime claims from the buyer to the seller. And some of the things that I see a lot of: torn screens, missing or torn screens, caulking. Please caulk the tub. Really? Not a defective item in the, but many of the inspectors put it in their reports. Roofing has become a real issue, and you know, if the roof's not leaking, it's not considered defective. So if you've got an older roof, it's not leaking, you don't really have a claim on the seller. But where your older roof can come in is trying to get insurance and trying to be able to at least close on your house before you have to put a new roof on. So those are important paragraphs to know. It's important, if you're working with the buyer, that you temper their request to be reasonable. You can tear up a relationship by asking for a lot of little nitpicking things, and then maybe the buyer needs to later on get an extension of the closing date. And if you've gotten an acrimonious relationship set up in this paragraph, then possibly you can limit your chances for cooperation from the seller later on. So keep that in mind. Here the sellers, Deborah, go ahead.
So is there a contingency in the contract for insurance? Like if the buyer can't get insurance because of an older roof or something?
Nope.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough situation, and that many insurance companies aren't writing policies for older roofs. Or they'll write it with the idea that you have to agree to replace it within a period of time after you take ownership. So again, that's the seller's disclosures usually, and many agents will upload it with the MLS listing. But again, call and ask. You
Jeff,
look at a
Jeff-
roof, know how old it is.
Jeff, just a point to that, since that I've been going through this. Just make sure you do your research, because if there's a roof that they're not gonna insure and they're getting a mortgage, now you have a problem. And then, as he said, if you can get it installed with a certain, depending on, because right now, due to the hurricane, the stock for roofs are in low, we can't get it. So they're in high demand, but we can't get them. So there's lies a problem. Most insurance companies are requiring 60, if you get that you're gonna put the roof down within 60 days, you're gonna make sure you can get that stock within 60 days and have the roof installed for that policy to be effective.
There's not too many roofs being installed in 60 days in
Nope,
these parts.
none.
So, yeah, I think the roof is become an issue, and I can tell you why from my personal experience. We put a claim in on Irma on our roof, and when we put the claim in, the quote we got was $35,000 to fix the roof. And by the time we went through the whole rigmarole, got denied 4 or 5 times, and finally they came back and said, okay, we'll put the roof on. It was $74,000. So the cost of roofs has gone crazy. And part of it is the lack of supply of tiles and material. And part of it is the fact that they're just, not enough quality contractors out there doing roofs. So be careful to do your homework up front. And make sure you don't want your buyer, buying is an emotional process for anybody, right? And especially buying, something that's one of the largest of investments of your life. And you get excited and you start picturing what it's gonna look like and what kind of furniture you're gonna have and all that. And then all of a sudden find out that you have a huge roadblock up ahead of you that you didn't anticipate. So try to cover these things up front with the with your buyer, and make sure you set we talk a lot about setting expectations. The more you can do to set expectations, the smoother things are gonna go. And if you've had the discussion, then it's not like, oh, you didn't ever told me. No, you want to have the discussion. So the seller's maintenance obligation and the walkthrough inspection are really important parts of this contract, and they're true for an as-is contract or a regular contract. The seller agrees to maintain the property in the condition it was in when you went to contract, which is one of the most important concepts in this contract, regardless of inspections and repairs and all that. If something happens if the air conditioner goes out, or the roof has a leak, or there's any condition of the property that occurs after you went to contract, you have the right to ask the seller to put it back in the condition that it was in before you went to contract. And if you go to the walkthrough and it's not, you have the right to ask the seller to escrow 200% of the 200% of the cost, and that's not a limit on what the seller has to pay. Okay. Walkthrough inspections are, I think, one of the most important events in the contract. That's your buyer making sure that everything is, repairs have been done, that the property's been normally a day before closing. So if you open the garage and it's still full of debris and paint cans and everything, that's a red flag that the buyer can say to the seller, hey, this is broom swept condition here, and that garage is certainly not in broom swept condition. So again, the walkthrough is important. Don't please put yourself in a position where you are the designated representative Because if there's a problem, generally our email will not cover you and you'll be on your own. So if the buyer says, gee, Lisa, I can't make it. Can you go do the walkthrough for me and let me know how it went? You say, sorry, I'm really sorry, but I can't do that. I'm not able to take on that kind of liability of something missing, something not repaired properly, a swap in the washer dryer, anything that I may not notice, I'd be liable for. So I think a suggestion would be bring the inspector back. Normally for $100, the inspectors will come back, verify the repairs have been done, verify that everything's working, the air conditioner and the appliances are working the way they should. You don't want that responsibility, and probably neither does your buyer. So try to avoid, no, you can't really go with your FaceTime and FaceTime a walkthrough because it's easy to miss stuff. And if there's inventory at all, now you've got your list that's signed off by the buyer and the seller. You can compare. You can say, wait a minute, that couch was supposed to be there. That bed was supposed to be there. That painting was supposed to be there. That's your chance to say, all parties agreed what would be here when we closed, and it's not there, and now you have leverage. But if it's what your recollection was when you saw it last, or what's shown in the MLS pictures, which could be staged furniture, you have no leverage. So please try not to take a risk on what's going to convey at closing. All right. The risk of loss paragraph is put in, and it has basically the bottom line in this contract is the seller is responsible for repairing and putting things back the way they were in this contract. And also the seller is responsible for 1% of the landscaping of the purchase price. In Far Bar, it's pruning and removal of trees only. So this is quite a bit more generous but if there was a 20-foot high oak tree in the middle of the yard that got blown away by the hurricane, the seller is responsible for paying up to 1% of the purchase price to put back as many trees and landscaping as was there. Okay. We do not have force majeure defined in the neighbor contract. It's called extreme weather. It's defined in there, but it's not as onerous as force majeure. So here's the next couple paragraphs. Here's what I highly recommend you do. I highly recommend you do a net sheet for your buyer and for your seller way early on in the process. And you can easily see that there's a number of things that the buyer and seller are responsible for in these paragraphs. But the time to find them out, not when your buyer gets the estoppel or your seller gets the estoppel and finds out there's charges on there that they weren't expecting. There's a number of great little apps and utilities that allow you to put the variable name of the contract. And even if in the seller's case, what was the original amount of their mortgage? And it will do a pretty good job of saying, okay, if you close at this contract price, here's, what your net's going to be. And a buyers especially totally underestimate the amount they're going to have to come up with at closing. They're thinking, well, 10% down, a couple other things. Usually it's a huge number. If there's financing, they have to put in a year of insurance, a year of taxes, and the number can be quite significant. And if they don't see that way in advance or even pre-contract, then you got a situation where you got a buyer that could be very unhappy with you, but because you didn't explain to them all the things that they're responsible for. So do a buyer and seller net sheet even in advance of the contract. The HOA disclosure and condo disclosure are baked into this contract. The key with the HOA disclosure is if you're on the sell side, get it signed by the buyer with the contract. If for some reason there's a lag between when the buyer signs that HOA disclosure and the contract, the buyer can trigger a 3-day right of rescission, which could include this closing day. So you don't want to give the buyer a get out of jail free card. You want that HOA disclosure to be signed very timely with the contract. Condominiums, we do not have a condominium rider as Farbar does. The buyer is entitled to 7 documents. Once they've received all 7, 3 business days to review and rescind, okay? We modified this paragraph a little bit in the latest release to make the buyer responsible for timely application to the HOA, or the condo association. A lot of buyers say, well, I'm gonna wait for the inspection, and I'm gonna wait for this, I'm gonna wait for my due diligence period to end before I apply to the association. So the contract says not later than 10 days after the effective date. And this paragraph goes on to say that the buyer's right to terminate the condition on them having made timely application. So what was happening is people were waiting to the last minute. They couldn't get the approval done. And the buyer said, oh, I'm going to cancel. Well, now if the buyer can't prove that they've applied timely, their right to cancel under this paragraph is nullified, right? Okay. Always name an escrow agent on the contract. The law requires that you specify who's going to hold the buyer's money. It does not have to be the closing agent, but it does have to be a fiduciary. If the seller is a foreign seller, then you get into this FERPTA withholding. Won't spend a lot of time on it today, but if the seller is a foreign seller and ask the buyer to sign that exemption so they can have lower withholding, make sure the buyer understands what they're signing. And you don't want to be the person explaining that to them. You want a financial advisor or somebody that, you know, understands the whole FERPTA process to be explaining that to them, because you don't want them to rely on your interpretation of what they're signing there. So this was the paragraph where we took out texting as a form of notification. Notification has to be in the form of an email, in the form of in-person FedEx, any type of documental delivery. The texting is no longer considered a valid way to notify. In the we've added this year to all of the possible addendums that could be added to the contract. Remember, if you've got an addendum, you got to check the box here, and it's got to be included for the seller's signature in the contract. And these are addendum. The seller disclosure, all those things are not addendums, so they don't need to be listed here. I see a lot of people list them there, but they're not addendum. They don't accompany the contract and become part of the contract. All right. We always have the wire fraud advisory in front of the buyer seller signature. That's our hope that they'll read that. It's in all caps and dark letters. Make sure the seller understands, the buyer understands that we don't do anything with wiring instructions. Those are going directly from the closer. They should come in encrypted form. And if there's any change, make sure they understand that there's a lot of fraudsters out there that would love to send them an email that looks like it came from the title company or from you, that's demanding a change in the wiring instructions. And if they get anything like that, they need to call the closing agent personally and say, did you just send me a wire transfer? I've seen a lot of carnage from the buyer getting an email 2 days before closing that the wiring instructions have changed, and they go wire it to somebody else, and that somebody else has nothing to do with the contract. And there's a whole unit of the FBI that's headquartered out of Tampa that deals with wire fraud and business compromise email is what they call themselves. But if you can get notification to them within really 24 hours of the wire, they have a 70 or 80% success rate in getting the money back. So if you're ever involved in a wire fraud, there's a number to call the FBI, and they'll contact the parties that are involved and try to help you. They literally are rabid about getting money back, but you have to notify them, you have to give them the information. And you're never to be involved in this, you never will be. So if somebody uses your email signature to convince somebody to change wiring instructions, make sure that your buyer or seller knows that you'll never be involved in that. And if you get anything from you with anything to do with their money, that it's a fraud. So. All right, I ran over about 10 minutes. In the bottom of this contract, you need to want to identify the selling broker and the listing broker and the licensee, and there's your escrow agent that has to go in there. And I want to call your attention to the last line of the contract. This contract shall not modify the listing contract or any MLS or other offer of compensation made by the seller or listing broker. You cannot change commissions in the sales contract. The sales contract is between the buyer and the seller. The listing contract is between the seller and the listing broker. So remember, if there's a change of compensation that's being done by negotiation, then it's got to be done in writing between the broker and the closing agent, or between the two brokers, if there's a mutual change there. So be careful of that. I've seen people go into the other terms and conditions and write, buyer's agent to give buyers credit of 2% or 5% or whatever at closing. If that's in these terms, it's not binding and it's not enforceable. Deborah. Did you have your hand up?
No, sorry, that was from before, I think.
No problem. So the last thing for today is, please understand that we're not lawyers. Our license allows us to fill contracts in and explain them to customers. Please, if you have a simple line, seller to credit buyer $10,000 at closing toward their prepaid expenses and closing costs, fine. But if it's if the radon's over 4.5 and the seller says they won't, anything that is has any complications is to be done by a lawyer. And your broker, I have lots of legally approved, legally sufficient language that I've gotten from attorneys over the years that can help you. But please don't get out your pen or your typewriter or your word processor and put anything in there without approval, because you could be convicted of practicing law without a license, and you may not have a license if you do that. The FREC has no sense of humor for that stuff. Okay, so that's it. How to write a bulletproof contract. Thanks to Holly Harmon for these ideas, just to try to make you more and more knowledgeable and more able to do the best job for your customer. And we're skill-based, and the more we know about these contracts, the more we can help our buyers and sellers with them, the better off we are. Any questions or comments?
Jeff, that was
Thank you
great.
very much.
And did you say there was also some of her like notes or something
Yeah,
that she had
sure,
written to go along with this?
I can put those out for you, no problem.
Okay.
This is more-
I do have one more question, Jeff.
Pardon?
What is the normal amount to put down for escrow? Here.
It varies. Captain, help me out here. I think sellers like 10%, don't they?
Yeah, they like 10%, but again, Jeff, you explained it very well. It depends on, every contract's different. And depending on what listing it is, you use the example of 5,000 first and then the second one coming in stronger to get to that 10% and different things. So again, it just depends on the situation. And you also explained it well by saying, depending on which side you're on, contact the buyer. If you represent the buyer, contact the seller agent, find out what the motivation is, find all those things out. That's going to help you write the contract to see how it's important, and vice versa on the other side. So if you're financing, yeah, I normally will start out with your same kind of principle, you know, by a smaller amount followed by, after 16 days, you know, if I have an inspection of 15 of a larger amount. So.
So I guess that's kind of accepted practice, knowing
Yeah,
that the
it's-
additional deposit will only be put down after inspections.
If your buyer's FHA and they're putting 3% down, they don't have 10% to put down. So, you know, if it's a VA loan, a lot of those go for 100%. So, you know, the buyer put down a modest deposit and get that back at closing. So some of it depends on the financing amount, but if you're putting down 20% for your mortgage, you know, the seller's likely to ask you to put some, you know, some decent money down at least at the second deposit. All right,
Yeah, thank you very much.
no problem. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Broker Jeff.
Appreciate it.
Call me if
Thank
need-
you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.